Welcome to A Philosophy of Action. Today we're talking about the second part of security and protection, internal policy, specifically policing, law and justice. This could be a short episode because internal policy follows the same principles as foreign policy. It all comes down to applying the three core principles of a philosophy of action: having descendants, surviving, and thriving. Any law or internal policy that succeeds in doing these things in the full accounting is a good law. So the real question is, what does that look like in practice? Or rather, what kind of considerations could a person make? The law intentionally is about how the state protects and enables people to flourish. To enforce that, you need both regional and national policing. Regional police handles local disputes, builds trusts and draws on local knowledge, and they know the people, the history, the community context, which makes them effective at resolving local conflicts. And of course, the national police focuses on crimes against the state or against the national community. Why should these two be separate? Because the local police often face conflicting interests. They may ignore crimes that benefit locals but harm the state, or they may let someone off simply because he's not a bad guy. National forces avoid that problem by handling crimes that threaten the wider community without having any connections to the local community, that is. Which laws should exist? The motivation of any law should be the survival, descendants and thriving of the community. But laws must also be practical, enforceable and applicable. A law that can't realistically be enforced is worse than useless. For example, banning easily produced, widely used substances like cannabis often backfires. Enforcement is nearly impossible and the side effects aren't always obvious, and the users don't feel very strongly to stop. A law like that drains resources and undermines legitimacy. On top of that, it creates a large black market that can no longer be controlled or co-opted. Criminal law should target violations of the core principles. Take murder. It directly attacks survival. If the state cannot protect citizens from murder, it loses legitimacy. After all, the core value of survival is violated. So laws against murder are essential. But then comes the next question. What do we do with the murderer? How to treat criminals? Traditionally, punishment has three functions. The punishment itself, making the act unpleasant enough to discourage repeating it. Deterrence, showing others what happens if they commit the same crime. And rehabilitation, returning offenders to society when and if possible. If you don't use the death penalty, rehabilitation becomes central. Otherwise, lifelong imprisonment is just a slow-motion death sentence, warehousing someone until they die. Key therefore is that the death penalty is generally counterproductive over alternatives as well. Specifically, a philosophy of action asks, what benefits do the punishments bring to society? Prison is costly, often ineffective, and concentrates criminals together, where they can teach each other crime. A rehabilitation system, such as in Norway, however, focuses on reintegration and sees the very low rates of reoffending. By contrast, long punitive sentences are expensive, reduce rehabilitation opportunities, and may actually increase reoffenses. On top of that, the victim's role is often ignored. Like I said before, there's traditionally, three main functions: punishment, deterrence, and rehabilitation. However, where's the victim in all this? Victims are too often sidelined. Punishment becomes about the state and the offender with little regard for those harmed. but victims should be compensated, even in severe crimes like abuse or murder. Victims, or families, should receive restitution. Some form of restitution anyway. That restitution could come from the offender, or in some cases the state. Here's where labor becomes useful. Penal labor could turn punishment into a productive work, funding restitution for victims, offsetting state costs, and serving as a punishment at the same time. Proportional punishments are also important. Minor crimes like theft or fighting can be dealt with through fines, restitution, and community service. However, more serious crimes require heavier measurements. But even then, the focus should not just be revenge. The question is, can this person be rehabilitated? Or what kind of benefit can they serve society? A one-time murderer might be able to be rehabilitated, but a serial killer probably cannot. In those cases, society may reasonably decide rehabilitation is impossible within the law. Where rehabilitation is possible, punishment could be a mix of corporal punishment, strictly regulated, non-lethal and non-disabling, with psychological help and reintegration. Short, sharp punishment can create deterrence without the cost of long imprisonment. Lastly, or more importantly, the death penalty and why it fails. The death penalty is incompatible with the philosophy of action in most cases, but not all. It can cause irreversible errors. By executing innocents, you destroy effectively the state's legitimacy by violating their right to survive for no crime committed. It is a loss of labor. Even guilty criminals can contribute to society through work. And it's a wasted potential. Executions end a life that could have contributed in other ways to society and that could maybe have in some way repaid their crimes. If a criminal wishes to die, assisted dying might be an option, but execution wastes resources and risks injustice. There are of course cases in which it could be necessary, but that has more to do with more esoteric cases whereby the height where reoffense is nearly certain but imprisonment is somehow impossible. This is more a theoretical case, but because in practice that seems unlikely. But think about some kind of alternative super serial killing prison escape artist. But again, there are rare cases, but it's about the theory and about applying it. Criminals are still part of society, and criminals are also still people who want to survive, thrive, and have descendants. Therefore, if you strip away their entire future, they become resentful and more likely to reoffend. Also, don't criminalize behavior that doesn't violate the three core principles. People should be free to live their lives because freedom increases their ability to compete and flourish. Now, the key part about criminals being part of society and wanting to survive, thrive, and have descendants is that should be always in the back of the head of lawmakers. These criminals have their own life goals. Punishment is important. Rehabilitation is important. But make sure that you don't push people into a corner where they have no way out, which is what imprisonment feels like to me a lot of the time. If you go to prison for life, then your life is effectively over, but you're not going to be put to death. Therefore, such types of punishments, especially for example for lifelong labor punishments in a case of very severe crimes with low chance that they will be rehabilitated, are only to be issued for the most severe of crimes, because such people will effectively see no reason not to do anything within their power to get out of it. The key, therefore, is also for punishments to be rational and not emotional. The state must never punish from anger, but instead it should ask, how can we compensate the victim? What can we get out of the perpetrator? And can they be rehabilitated or not? The goal is always the full accounting for survival, descendants, and thriving of the community as a whole. After all, that is the responsibility of the state. Now, internal policy isn't only about crime. Take elections, for example. If you want a democracy to function, the key question is who should vote. Universal suffrage sounds fair, but it can produce perverse incentives. We already restrict age, for example. Under 18-year-olds can't vote because they're not considered responsible or invested enough. But what about the elderly? Many in the boomer generation, for example, and especially for people over 60 or 70 years old, often admit that they don't care about the long-term consequences of what's happening to society, because they'll say something on the lines of, I'll be dead by then anyway. When large numbers of voters don't care about the long term for society, the government becomes more short term. Elected officials have no incentives to think beyond the next decade, because their voters won't be alive to see the further effects. This weakens long-term planning and undermines society's ability to thrive across generations. And with this I would like to segue into the next episode. This is, after all, what forms of election or government would work best under a philosophy of action. So, how should a government be structured within a society? Or rather, on what principles should governments be structured within a society that lives by a philosophy of action? Well, that's a topic for another day. Have a good one, and have a nice day.